The morning James Collier drove out from Abilene to find me, I was doing what I do most April mornings, sitting on the porch watching the cattle move through the near pasture, deciding which ones I could trust and which ones I could not. Cattle will tell you a great deal about themselves before 8 o'clock if you pay attention. Most people do not pay attention. That has always struck me as a waste of a good morning. Collier was younger than I expected. They usually are. He had a motor car which he parked at the gate with some ceremony, and a leather satchel that looked like it had never been set down on dirt. He introduced himself twice, the way nervous people do, and told me the Kansas State Historical Society had sent him, and that he was writing about the early settlement years, and that my name had come up several times as someone who had been here from nearly the beginning. I told him to sit down, and I poured him coffee from the pot I keep on the porch rail in the mornings. He looked out at the pasture, at the cattle barn, which is a good solid structure of milled lumber built in 1891 with proper ventilation and a shingled roof and everything a cattle barn in 1914 is supposed to have. He looked at the house, which is not large but is well kept. He looked at all of it the way young men from town look at things that have turned out better than they expected. "It seems you've done very well here, Mrs. Hagan," he said. I have heard that sentence, or something close to it, many times. People say it like they are granting a pardon. "That barn," I said, "I built in 1891. You see it, and you think you understand something about how I got here." I set down my coffee cup. The barn that mattered was the one I built in 1873. It cost me $1.60. It looked nothing like that. I nodded toward the pasture. But 11 cattle went into it in November of that year, and in the morning after the coldest night in the recorded history of this county, all 11 of them were still standing. Collier opened his satchel and found his notebook. "The man with the largest operation in this valley," I said, "spent more than $200 on his cattle barn. He lost 4 animals that same night. He was a careful man and an experienced one, and he did everything the way it was supposed to be done. I have thought about that difference for 41 years. I am not sure I have finished thinking about it yet." Collier looked up from his notebook. I could see he had decided this was going to be a better morning than he had planned for. "Tell me from the beginning," he said. The beginning, for the purpose of this story, is October of 1873. But to understand October of 1873, you need to understand what Kansas looked like to a person who had never seen it. I had been here 12 years by that point, which means I had had time to stop being surprised by it. But I remember the surprise. I remember stepping off the wagon in the spring of 1861. I was 26 years old, and my husband Eric was 30, and looking out at a landscape that had no end and no interruption and no mercy in its openness. In Norway, where I was born and grew up, land has shape. The fjords cut into the rock, and the mountains hold the valleys, and you are always oriented by what is above you and what is below. The land tells you where you are. Kansas does not do that. Kansas is a flat declaration that you are entirely on your own, and the sky above it is so large and unmediated that on certain days it feels less like weather and more like a statement of intent. Eric loved it. That was one of the things about him. He could look at a hard thing and find the plain beauty in it without pretending the hardness wasn't there. He was that kind of man. Not foolish. He knew what the plains winters could do. But he had a quality of acceptance that I sometimes envied and sometimes found maddening, depending on the season and the size of the problem. He died in August of 1872. Typhoid fever which came in fast and did not hesitate. He was 41 years old. We had been here 11 years and had built the claim into something that was not quite comfortable but was solid and pointed in the right direction. We had 160 acres, a small cabin of reasonable construction, and a herd of 11 Hereford cattle that we had purchased on credit the previous spring. The credit was the problem that remained after Eric was gone. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to make the months after a death sound like a series of practical difficulties, and the practical difficulties were real, but they were not the whole of it. I was 38 years old, and I had spent 12 years building something with a person, and that person was no longer there. I will not try to describe that particular geography. There are no words for it that are not smaller than the thing itself. What I will say is this: his coat hung on the hook behind the cabin door for a long time after he was gone. I did not move it. I told myself it was practical. It was a good coat and I might need it in winter. That was not the real reason, but it was a reason I could say out loud, and sometimes that is enough to get through a day. By October of 1873, the debt to Hendricks's store stood at $47. My line of credit had $3 remaining on it. The cattle were healthy. The harvest had been reasonable, enough grain stored to see through a hard season, enough hay cut and stacked for the animals. The problem was shelter. A Kansas Plains winter is not a Montana winter, and I would not pretend otherwise. But it is its own specific cruelty. The temperature can drop below zero and stay there for a week. The wind comes from the north without interruption. There are no hills, no tree lines of consequence, nothing to break or deflect it. It crosses the open ground at speed and finds every gap and crack and insufficiency in whatever you have built. And it takes the heat out of everything it finds. I had seen cattle freeze in a barn that looked perfectly solid from the outside. The cold does not need much of an opening to do its work. The barn I had, the original structure Eric and I had built in our third year, was aging. The chinking between the logs had dried and cracked. There were gaps along the north wall that I could put 3 fingers through in places. For a mild winter it would do. For a hard one, it would not. Every man I asked gave me the same answer. You need new construction, milled lumber, properly fitted, well-chinked, solid roof. The going rate for sufficient lumber freighted out from Abilene was enough to cover the north wall and 2 sides, $38 minimum, before labor. I had $3 on credit and $47 of debt. I sat with those numbers at the table for 2 evenings in a row. I did not arrive at any solution. The numbers were what they were. It was on the second evening that Clarence Whitmore came by. Whitmore had been in the valley since 1859. He was 52 years old in 1873, a large, deliberate man who ran 480 acres and 60 cattle and conducted both with the same methodical confidence. He was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to remember him as a villain, and he was not one. He was a man who had survived 14 years on the Kansas plains by knowing what worked, and he had accumulated that knowledge at real cost, and he considered it his duty to share it with those who had less of it. That is not a bad quality. It only becomes a problem when the person offering the knowledge mistakes it for the only knowledge there is. He came to the door with his hat in his hand and told me he had heard I was in a difficult position regarding winter shelter for my cattle. News travels on the plains the way wind does without asking permission. He told me he had given it some thought and that he believed the most sensible course was for me to sell a portion of the herd now while the prices were still reasonable, use the proceeds to make the necessary repairs to the existing structure, and carry a smaller number of animals through the winter on what I had. He named a price for 6 animals. It was 60% of what they were worth. I asked him why so low. He said, with the patience of a man explaining something to someone who did not fully grasp the situation, that everyone would be selling as winter approached, that the buyers knew this, and that 60% now was better than nothing in February, when the animals were dead and the options had narrowed further. I stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," I said. "I'll think on it." He put his hat back on. "Mrs. Hagan," he said, and his tone was not unkind, "you have been here 12 years. You know what a Kansas winter can do. This is not a year to experiment." He left. I watched the dust from his horse settle back onto the road. The thing about Whitmore's advice was that it was reasonable. I knew it was reasonable. Sell 6 cattle at a loss, repair what you have, survive the winter smaller, but intact. That was the logic of experience, and experience on the plains had earned its authority. I could not argue with the reasoning. What I could not reconcile was the arithmetic on the other side of it. If I sold 6 animals, I would have enough to make the repairs and clear part of the debt. I would have 5 cattle, which was not enough to build back from, not at my age, not alone. I would have made it through one winter and closed off most of the winters after it. I went back to the table and looked at the numbers again. And somewhere between looking at the numbers and looking at the lamp and looking at the coat on the hook behind the door, I thought about my grandmother. Her name was Astrid. She lived her whole life in Vestlandet, on a farm cut into rock above a fjord, and she raised cattle through 60 winters in a country that was not kind to the endeavor. She never explained things. That was her manner. She showed you something, and if you were paying attention, you understood it, and if you were not, she showed you again without comment. When I was 11 or 12 years old, I remember watching her pack the outer walls of the cattle shelter with bundles of compressed straw before the first deep freeze. She worked methodically, binding each bundle tight before she placed it, fitting them against the wall and against each other with a care that seemed out of proportion to the material. Straw. It was everywhere. It cost nothing. I asked her why. She looked at me for a moment in the way she had, as if she were deciding whether the question deserved a direct answer or a demonstration. Straw remembers summer, she said. Every stem is a small room with air inside it. Air that is not moving does not carry cold the way air that is moving does. You are not warming the barn. You are keeping the wind from taking away the warmth that is already there. I was 12 years old, and I thought she was speaking poetry, sitting at the table in October of 1873, 38 years old and alone, with 11 cattle and $3 of credit and a north wall with gaps I could put my hand through. I understood she had been speaking mathematics. I blew out the lamp and went to bed. In the morning, I went out to the east field where the harvested grain stalks stood in rows, and I began to understand in practical terms how much straw I had. It was more than enough. I want to describe what it looks like to think through a problem you have never solved before, because people tend to remember their good ideas as if they arrived whole and obvious, and that has not been my experience. My experience is that a good idea arrives as a discomfort, an irritation, something that does not fit the way you expected it to fit, and you have to worry at it for a while before it becomes anything useful. The morning after Whitmore's visit, I walked the east field for an hour before I touched a single straw. The harvested stalks stood in rows where the grain had been cut, wheat straw, dry and pale gold in the October light, enough of it to fill a room twice over. Eric and I had kept it for bedding and for banking the foundation against drafts. We had never used more than a quarter of what a season produced. The rest went back into the soil or blew across the property in the spring winds. I had never thought of it as a building material. Nobody in this valley did. I stood in the field and tried to hear my grandmother's voice again, not the words. I remembered the words well enough. What I was trying to remember was the way she handled the bundles, the compression, the care she gave to binding each one tight before it went against the wall. She had not been careless with the process. She had been specific, and specificity in a woman like Astrid was always purposeful because she did not have time for anything that wasn't. I picked up a handful of loose straw and held it against the wind. The wind moved through it easily. I could feel the cold of it on my palm right through the straw, immediate and unimpeded. This was the problem I was trying to solve, not cold itself, but cold traveling. Cold carried on moving air, which found its way through every loose and unconsidered material and delivered itself directly to whatever warmth it found on the other side. I compressed the handful of straw between my palms, pressing until it was dense and tight. Held it against the wind again. The cold was still there, but it arrived slower, dulled somehow, muffled. as if the wind had farther to travel to reach my skin through a country that offered it more resistance. I stood there for a moment with compressed straw between my palms and thought about what my grandmother had actually said. Not that straw was warm, that air not moving did not carry cold the way air that was moving did. The loose straw let wind pass through, and wind was the enemy. The compressed straw trapped the air inside itself, in the small hollow chambers of each individual stem, in the spaces between stems pressed together, and trapped air was still air, air that was going nowhere, air that was not a delivery mechanism for the cold outside. It was not warmth I would be building into the walls. It was stillness. I did not begin with the cattle barn. I began with 2 wooden crates, each about the size of a bread box, which I had in the storage lean-to. I set them both on the open ground north of the cabin, where they would receive the full overnight cold and the full north wind, which in October was already carrying the preliminary announcement of what was coming. The first crate I left as it was. The second I packed around the outside with compressed straw bundles, binding them against the sides with strips of old harness leather, 2 inches of tight-packed straw on every face. Inside each crate I placed a tin cup of water. This was not my idea exactly. It was the kind of thing Astrid would have done. She verified things. She did not proceed on confidence alone, which is a practice I have found more useful than almost any other in a life that has required a significant amount of proceeding. The temperature that night went down to 18 degrees. There was wind. In the morning, the first crate held a solid block of ice where the cup had been. The cup in the second crate had a thin skim of ice across the top, less than 1/8 of an inch, and water beneath it that was cold but liquid. I stood and looked at both crates for a long time. I was not triumphant about this. I was not yet at the stage of the problem where triumph was appropriate. What I was, standing in that field in the October cold, was certain enough to continue. 2 inches of compressed straw had meant the difference between frozen and not frozen. I needed to protect a cattle barn. I would need more than 2 inches. I would need to know how much more, and I would need to build it in a way that wind could not find a path around or through, and I would need to build it before the hard freeze, which the particular color of the November sky in those years told you was perhaps 3 weeks away, perhaps less. I went back inside and found a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and began to draw. I am not an engineer. I want to be plain about that. What I did on that paper was not engineering in the formal sense. It was the kind of thinking that a person does when they have a clear problem and limited materials and no one available to ask for guidance. You draw what you know. You mark the directions the wind comes from. You think about where the warmth is and where the cold is trying to enter, and you try to place your material between those 2 things as completely as you can. The north wall was the priority. That was where the wind drove hardest and longest. I calculated what a wall of straw bundles would look like at 18 inches of compressed depth. 18 inches. Because the 2-inch experiment had been promising, and I wanted significantly more margin than promising. I marked the east and west walls at 12 inches. The south wall I left open to consideration, because the south wall in winter received what sun there was, and I did not want to insulate against the one thing that was working in my favor. The roof was its own problem, which I set aside temporarily. The question I returned to, after the walls were mapped on the paper, was the clay. Loose straw let wind through. Compressed straw resisted it. But compressed straw was still a material with gaps. Small ones, but gaps. And a sustained north wind at 30 or 40 miles per hour is a patient investigator of gaps. I needed something to face the outside of the straw walls that would tell the wind there was nothing to investigate. Something that would seal the surface completely. The creek bed a quarter-mile east of the property had a clay deposit that I had used for chinking the cabin walls. It was good clay, dense and gray, the kind that holds together when you roll it between your fingers, that dries hard and does not crumble easily. I had used it mixed with water alone, which was how Eric and I had always done it, and it had cracked in the cold, sometimes badly. I had rechinked the same sections 2 and 3 times over the years. I thought about why it cracked. When clay dries, it shrinks. Shrinkage creates tension in the material. Tension, if there is nothing to absorb it, becomes a crack. This is not a profound observation. Any person who has watched mud dry in summer has seen it happen. The question is whether you have considered what it means for what you are building. I mixed a small batch of clay that morning and worked into it 2 things: a double portion of fine sand and a quantity of short-cut straw pieces about 2 inches long. The sand reduced the shrinkage. The straw, embedded throughout the clay like a coarse weaving, gave the drying material something to hold on to when the tension tried to pull it apart. The cracks, when they came, would stop at the nearest straw fiber rather than traveling the length of the wall. I knew this because I had seen it, not in clay walls, but in the mud nests of bank swallows, which lined their nesting cavities with grass. Those nests survive rain and temperature change without failing. Whatever the swallows understood about mixing materials, they had been right about it for considerably longer than I had been building anything. I spread the clay mixture on a flat board and left it to dry. It took 3 days. When it dried, it had 3 small cracks, each about a ½ inch long, none of which went all the way through the material. That was acceptable. That was, in fact, better than anything I had achieved with plain clay in 12 years of homesteading. I began cutting straw the following morning. The work of compressing straw is straightforward and relentless. You gather an armful of dry stalks, align them as well as you can manage, lay them between 2 flat boards, and stand on the top board until the bundle has compressed to your target depth. You bind it with twine or leather or whatever cordage you have, tightly enough that the bundle holds its density when the boards are removed. Then you do it again. Each bundle, at 18 inches of compression, weighed close to 40 pounds and was roughly the size of a large traveling trunk. I needed 80 of them for the north wall alone. On the first day, I made 14. I will not pretend this was easy work or that I was moving quickly. I was 38 years old and not small. I had done farm labor my whole adult life, and I was capable of the physical requirement, but the October wind was already cold enough to make sustained outdoor work a matter of concentration, and I was working alone, which meant every step of the process fell to a single pair of hands and a single back. I had been at it for perhaps 3 hours when I noticed someone had stopped on the road. A wagon, drawn by a single gray horse, had come to a standstill about 40 yards from where I was working. The woman holding the reins was someone I recognized by sight but had not spoken to at any length, one of the Mennonite families who had arrived from somewhere in Russia or the Ukraine the previous year and settled a claim about 2 miles to the northeast. She was older than me by some years, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that has spent a great deal of time outdoors and made its accommodation with that fact. She looked at what I was doing, not quickly. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they are actually trying to understand. Then she said something in German that I did not follow, and I told her I spoke English and some Norwegian, but very little German, and she nodded as if this were a reasonable limitation, and said in accented but competent English, "How many more do you need?" I told her I needed 66 more for the north wall alone, and a good many after that. She wrapped the reins around the brake handle and got down from the wagon. Her name, I learned later that afternoon, was Agnes Friesen. She had been on the plains for 14 months. She did not explain why she had stopped, and I did not ask. On the frontier, you learn to accept useful things without requiring them to justify their arrival. We worked until the light failed. I learned 2 things about Agnes Friesen that first afternoon. The first was that she knew how to compress straw, not approximately, but correctly, with a particular angle of pressure that produced a denser bundle than my method and held its shape better. The second was that she was not a person who talked while she was working. Both qualities struck me as evidence of good judgment. Before she left, she picked up the board on which my clay sample had dried. She examined the surface carefully, running her thumb across the small cracks. She shook her head once, not with disapproval, but with the specific expression of someone who has seen a problem before and knows what it wants. She put the board down and pointed at the ratio of clay to sand in the mixing pile, then held up 4 fingers on one hand and one on the other. More sand, considerably more. She did not explain further. She climbed back onto her wagon and drove north toward her claim. I adjusted the mixture that evening. When that second batch dried 2 days later, I found one crack less than a 1/4 inch, and it stopped before it reached the surface. On the 7th day of the work, Whitmore came back. He brought 2 men with him, Harold Beam, who did carpentry work for several families in the valley, and Samuel Cross, who had homesteaded 6 years and considered that sufficient credential for most opinions. They arrived in the late morning and stood at a distance for a while before they came closer, in the manner of men who have not decided yet whether they are visiting or inspecting. I kept working. Whitmore looked at the north wall, which by that point stood 4 feet high and 14 feet across. Straw bundles fitted close and faced with the clay mixture, drying in the pale sun. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already concluded is wrong and is now searching for the specific vocabulary of that wrongness. "Mrs. Hagan," he said, "I will grant that you have been industrious." I thanked him for that. "Straw burns," he said. "The outside is clay," I said. "Clay does not burn. Clay cracks. This clay has sand and cut straw mixed through it. It cracks less." He was quiet for a moment. Harold Beam had walked to the wall and placed his hand flat against the clay surface. He pressed. He moved his hand to one of the bundle joints and pressed there as well. His expression did not change, but he did not step back from the wall either. A carpenter will tell you a great deal with his hands if you are watching. "The whole valley knows what you are attempting here," Whitmore said finally. Not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who believes the whole valley's knowing is itself a relevant fact. I came out of respect for Eric. He was a solid man. But this, he gestured at the wall, this is not how it is done. I looked at him. "I know," I said. "That is the reason I am doing it." He put his hat back on and said nothing further. The 3 men rode back toward the road. Harold Beam looked back once at the wall before the road bent and took them out of sight. I picked up the next bundle and fitted it into place. There is a particular quality to the light in Kansas in late October that I have never been able to describe adequately to anyone who has not seen it. It is not soft and it is not warm. It is a low, flat, traveling light that moves across the open ground like something with purpose, and it shows you everything without flattering any of it. The shadows it makes are long and lean and precise. In that light, the walls I was building looked exactly like what they were: straw packed into a shape, faced with gray clay, sitting in a field, and I found I was grateful for the honesty of it. There was no hour of the day when what I was doing looked more accomplished than it was. This kept me careful. Agnes Friesen came back on the 2nd day, and the 3rd, and every day after that for the duration of the building, though never at the same hour and never having sent word ahead. She arrived when she arrived and worked until she judged the light insufficient, and then she went home to her own claim and her own responsibilities, which were considerable. I never asked what she was setting aside to be there. I suspect the answer would have been uncomfortable for both of us. I watched her work. This was something I did deliberately. Agnes knew things in her hands that she did not have the English to explain, and I had learned from my grandmother that observation is a more reliable teacher than instruction, because instruction can be wrong and the hands rarely are. I watched how she handled the bundles. I watched how she fitted the joints between them. And on the 3rd day, I watched her do something I had not seen before and could not immediately account for. At each corner of the rising north wall, where the structure was most exposed to lateral wind pressure, she cut short sections of branch wood, each about 2 feet long and no thicker than my wrist, and drove them into the ground at an angle, not straight down as you would set a fence post. At an angle, leaning perhaps 15 degrees into the direction the north wind would come from. Then she fitted the straw bundles around these angled stakes, binding them against the wood before packing the clay face over everything. I did not understand the purpose immediately. A fence post goes straight because straight is strongest against downward weight. These were not carrying downward weight. They were in the corners where the walls met, and they leaned north. I thought about it that evening. I thought about what Astrid had taught me, and about the 2-inch straw experiment, and about what I knew of wind and resistance. And somewhere before the lamp burned low, I understood it. A wall built straight against the wind receives all of the wind's force at a right angle, the most direct and complete delivery possible. A wall or anchor that leans into the wind deflects a portion of that force downward into the ground, which has been absorbing force without complaint since before either of us was born. Agnes was not strengthening the corners against the wind. She was redirecting the wind's argument to an opponent it could not move. I had not been taught this. I had watched it and then thought about it until it made sense. That is not the same as being taught, and the difference matters. A thing you have reasoned through is yours in a way that a thing you have been handed is not. I noted the technique and used it in every corner we built after that. The weather changed on the 10th day. I had known it was coming. There are signs on the plains that a person learns to read over years of being wrong about them. The particular gray at the north horizon that is different from ordinary cloud cover, the way the cattle stand with their backs to the wind before the wind has fully arrived, the drop in the sound of the world that happens when pressure changes. I had been reading these signs since morning and working faster because of them, and by mid-afternoon the sky had made its intentions plain enough that no reading was required. Agnes left earlier than usual. She looked at the sky once before she climbed onto the wagon and said something in German that I took, from her expression, to mean that tomorrow would be difficult. By 4 o'clock the wind had risen to what I judged to be 35 miles per hour. By 5 it was higher. It was not a blizzard. There was no snow, only cold and pressure, and a sustained roaring that is the specific voice of the plains at its most serious. It came from the north in continuous waves rather than gusts, which is in some respects worse than gusting because there is no rhythm to shelter yourself inside of. It simply does not stop. I was inside the cabin when I heard it, not the wind. I could hear nothing over the wind. But I was watching through the small north window, watching the walls I had built stand against the pressure when the northwest corner moved. It did not collapse immediately. It leaned first, a slow, deliberate leaning, like a person considering whether to sit down, and in the 2 seconds it took me to get my coat on and open the cabin door, it had made its decision. 4 feet of the corner section came apart, not dramatically, not in a heap, but in a kind of slow separation, the bundles losing their binding to each other, and the clay face cracking along the joints, and the whole northwest corner spreading itself back into its component parts across the ground. I stood in the wind and looked at it. The rest of the wall was standing. 11 feet of the north face held, the sections with the angled corner stakes, which I could see were bent slightly by the pressure, but had not yielded. The northwest corner had been one of the first sections I had built, before I understood Agnes's technique well enough to replicate it, and I had set those corner stakes straight rather than angled. The wind had found that difference and made use of it. I spent the remaining daylight retrieving the bundles that had scattered. The wind made this a negotiation rather than a task. Each bundle wanted to go wherever the wind was going, and I wanted it to go back into the stack, and we settled the argument by degrees. By the time the light was gone, I had recovered most of what had fallen and stacked it out of the wind behind the cabin wall. I went inside. I made a small fire. I sat at the table with the paper and the pencil stub and looked at what I had drawn. The calculation was not ruined. That was the first thing I established, because it needed to be established before I could think clearly about anything else. The rest of the wall was standing. The materials were mostly recovered. The corner would need to be rebuilt with the angled stakes from the ground up, which would cost 2 days. 2 days I had in the schedule, though barely. What I had lost was not time I could not recover. What I had lost was the particular confidence of a person who has not yet been proven wrong. I looked at Eric's coat on the hook behind the door. I will not say much about what I felt that evening. The honest account is that I sat at the table until the fire burned low and the cold came back into the room. And at some point, the distance between what I was trying to do and what I was capable of doing seemed very large. And I was aware of being alone in that distance in a way that the work, during the days, successfully prevented me from being aware of. And I was aware of Eric, not missing him in the abstract, but missing him in the specific, practical, immediate sense of needing another person in the room who believed the thing I was trying to do was possible. I did not have that. I had a coat on a hook and a wall that had partly fallen down in the wind. In the morning, before I had eaten or gone out to assess the damage in daylight, Agnes was at the door. She had a covered pot. She set it on the table without comment. Then she looked at me with the specific expression of a woman who has seen the inside of difficult winters and recognizes the look of someone who has passed a hard night. And she said nothing about any of it, which was the precise right response. We ate. Then we went outside. She looked at the fallen corner for a long time. She walked the perimeter of the wall, pressing her hand against the sections that had held, examining the angled stakes where they disappeared into the ground. Then she came back to the fallen corner and began without discussion to clear the debris and prepare the ground for rebuilding. The second version of that corner took most of the day. Agnes drove the new stakes herself, 4 of them, angled more steeply than the first time, driven deeper, set in a slight chevron rather than a straight line, so that the wind pressure on one would brace against the others. She did not explain this as she worked. I watched it and kept the explanation for later, when I was not needed for lifting. By evening, the corner was standing again, and the clay facing was going on. I stood back and looked at it. It was better than what had been there before. The wall that the wind had knocked down had, in falling, shown me what it needed to be, and the rebuilt version had that knowledge in it. I have thought about this often in the years since. The things you build after the first failure are usually stronger than the things you build before it, because the failure is a very specific and honest teacher. It tells you exactly which part of your confidence was not yet earned. The roof was where Agnes reached the limit of what she knew. I understood this not because she said so, she did not say so, but because I watched her look at the top of the walls for 3 days without proposing anything. Agnes Friesen was not a person who withheld ideas she had. When she looked at the walls, she saw what needed to happen, and her hands began before her mind had quite finished the sentence. When she looked at the roof, she looked the way I looked at it, with the attentiveness of someone working on a problem, not the attentiveness of someone accessing a known solution. We were in the same difficulty, different walls, same ceiling. The problem with the roof was weight and water. A straw roof could be built. The Scandinavian tradition of turf roofing, which I knew from Norway, was not entirely unlike what I had in mind, but straw alone would not shed water, and water in a straw wall meant rot, which meant collapse, which meant the cattle would be no warmer than the open field. I needed the straw's insulation, and I needed a waterproof surface over it, and I did not have timber enough for shingles or money enough for tar paper. I thought about this for 2 days while we completed the side walls. The answer came from looking at the ground rather than at the roof. The buffalo grass that covered the plains grew in dense, matted layers. The root system was as substantial as the visible grass, a tight weave of fibrous material that held together when you cut it and dried into a surface of considerable toughness. The settlers on the plains of Nebraska and Kansas had been making sod bricks from this material for 20 years, cutting them from the earth and stacking them into walls and roofs. I had seen sod houses. I had never thought to use the principle on a roof over a straw structure. I cut a section of sod 3 feet square and set it over a bundle of straw, grass side down. The grass roots made a surface that overlapped itself, fibers interlocking, with no clear pathway for water to find. Rain, hitting it, would run sideways rather than straight down, exactly as water runs off a shingled roof, but without the shingles. And below the sod, the compressed straw would hold the warmth the roof was meant to keep inside. I showed Agnes. She pressed the sod surface with both palms, then tilted the whole piece and let it drain against her hand. She said something brief in German and turned back to the wall she had been working on, which I took as a sufficient endorsement. The sod cutting began the following morning. It was Ingrid Larson who first asked me what I was building. She was 24 years old, newly arrived from Minnesota with her husband Peter and a child of 2, and she came past the property on the road to Hendrick's store on a morning when the wind had briefly relented and I was on the roof frame, laying the first courses of sod. She stopped her wagon and shaded her eyes against the November light. "What is that?" she called up. "Cattle barn," I said. She looked at the walls, which were faced smooth with dried clay, and stood solid enough that they did not advertise their composition. She looked at the roof in progress, which was stranger-looking, the sod courses going down grass side first, building up in overlapping layers. "My husband says Mr. Whitmore says it won't work," she said, not accusatory. Informational, in the way of a young woman who is still in the habit of reporting what her husband says before she has finished deciding what she thinks. "Mr. Whitmore may be right," I said. "I will know in January." She sat in the wagon for another moment. What happens in January? I looked at the north horizon, which had taken on again the specific gray that meant the weather was moving. "January is when we find out what everything is actually made of," I said. She held the reins and looked at the walls, not skeptically, with genuine attention, the way she might look at a piece of needlework she did not yet know how to identify. Then she clicked to her horse and continued toward the store. That same evening, Whitmore rode through and stopped at the road's edge long enough to tell me that his barometer had dropped 4 points since morning and was still falling. "Hard freeze coming," he said. "Maybe 10 days, maybe less." He looked at the barn, at the walls, at the half-finished roof, at the evidence of everything I had not yet completed. He did not say anything further. He did not need to. The arithmetic of 10 days and the work remaining was plain enough to read in the air between us without anyone making it into a sentence. He rode on. I stood in the field in the failing light and looked at what was done and what was not done, and calculated the days against each other until the numbers were as clear to me as they were going to get. The roof needed 4 more days. The south wall needed 2. The door needed to be rehung and weather-fitted. The floor needed a final thick layer of loose straw. There were gaps to be clayed, a drainage channel to be cut around the east wall, and a ventilation arrangement for the south face that I had been considering for a week without yet resolving. 10 days, if Whitmore's barometer was right. 10 days was enough. It was enough without margin, without the allowance for the unexpected that a careful person prefers, but it was enough if everything went as intended. On the frontier, you learn that everything going as intended is a pleasant theory, and that the actual work of survival happens in the space between the theory and what the weather decides to do next. I went back to the roof. I finished the roof on the 14th day. Not the 10th as I had calculated, not the 12th, which was the revised calculation after a morning of freezing rain made the sod too heavy to lift without it breaking apart, and I lost half a day waiting for it to drain. Not the 13th, when the ventilation arrangement on the south face required dismantling and rebuilding because the first version created a channel that drew cold air across the floor rather than releasing warm air above the cattle's backs, which was the opposite of what I needed and would have done quiet damage through the whole winter before I understood what was wrong. The 14th day in the late afternoon in thin November light, I set the last course of sod, tamped it down with the flat of the shovel, and stood back. Agnes was beside me. She had been there for most of the 14 days and was there for this one, and we stood together in the cold and looked at what we had made without saying anything for a while. It did not look like a cattle barn in the conventional sense. It looked like a low rectangular mound with a clay face and a door, and a small south-facing gap for ventilation, something between a structure and a feature of the landscape, as if the ground itself had made a considered decision about that particular location. The sod roof had already begun to look settled. Given a season, I thought, it would look as though it had always been there. Agnes put her hand flat on the clay wall, the way she always did when she was measuring something she could not measure with tools. She held it there for a moment. Then she nodded once and went to get her wagon. I brought in the 11 cattle that evening. It took longer than it should have. Cattle do not enter unfamiliar spaces without registering their opinions on the subject, but by full dark they were inside. The door was hung and fitted, and the canvas draft barrier I had rigged 3 feet inside the entrance was in place. 2 barriers between the animals and the outside air. The space between them would accept the cold from anyone entering and lose it before it reached the main chamber. This I had learned from a description of northern construction that Reverend Aldrich had mentioned in passing the previous spring, regarding how certain peoples in the far north managed the transition between outside cold and inside warmth. I had filed the idea away without knowing I was filing it. I stood outside in the dark after the door was closed and listened. No sound from inside that suggested distress. The cattle had made their initial protests and settled. I could hear, very faintly, the ordinary sounds of large animals in an enclosed space, the shift of weight, the occasional low vocalization, the specific quality of breath that tells you an animal is standing rather than in motion. I went to bed. The hard freeze that Whitmore's barometer had predicted arrived in the 3rd week of November and was serious without being the worst the season would offer. Temperatures went to 12 below zero on the coldest night of that first stretch, and the wind ran for 4 days without significant pause. I burned through my cabin firewood at a rate that concerned me and spent a portion of each of those 4 days cutting and splitting against the deficit. The cattle barn I visited morning and evening. Each morning I brought a lantern and set it inside the door while I checked the animals and the structure. I looked at the wall joints and at the clay facing on the interior side and at the roof where it met the top of the walls. I looked for signs of moisture coming through, for frost formation on the interior surfaces, for any indication that the cold was finding a path I had not anticipated. What I found each morning was this. The interior of the barn was cold by any comfortable standard, but it was not the cold of outside. It was not the cold that kills. It was the cold of a root cellar, perhaps, the cold that preserves rather than destroys. The animals moved normally. They ate normally. Their water, which I set in a wooden trough against the center of the north wall where the insulation was thickest, froze across the surface each night but did not freeze solid. I broke the skin of ice each morning, and the water beneath it was liquid. 11 cattle, all standing. I will tell you about the worst night, because that is what Collier asked me about when I reached this part of the telling, and because it is the part that I have thought about most often in the years since. The worst night was the 14th of December. Whitmore came by in the afternoon and told me his barometer had dropped further than he had ever recorded it dropping in 14 years. He said the temperature by his reckoning would go to 30 below zero or beyond with wind. He said it with the directness of a man delivering information he believes you need, regardless of what you intend to do with it. He looked at the barn when he said it. He did not editorialize. I thanked him, and he left. I spent the remaining afternoon hours making every preparation I could think of. I packed additional loose straw against the base of all 4 exterior walls where they met the ground. The junction of wall and earth is where cold finds its first argument with a structure. I re-examined every gap in the clay facing I could reach and worked additional clay into anything that looked uncertain. I packed the draft barrier tighter. I brought the cattle an extra portion of dry hay because the digestion of feed generates warmth in large animals, and I wanted that process working through the night. By dark, the temperature had already dropped to what I estimated was 10 below zero, and the wind was building. I went inside the cabin and made a fire and tried to sleep. At 2 in the morning, I was awake. The wind had reached a register I had not heard before, not louder exactly, but lower in pitch, a continuous pressure sound rather than the variable rushing of ordinary wind. It moved the cabin in ways I could feel in the floorboards. I lay still and listened to it for a while. Then I got up and put on my coat, Eric's coat. I put on Eric's coat, which still hung on the hook behind the door, and I went outside. The cold at that hour on that night was not like ordinary cold. It was a different category of experience, not just temperature, but physical pressure, an immediate and complete demand on every part of the body that was exposed to it. My breath turned to ice crystals before it had traveled 6 inches from my face. The ground underfoot was iron. The sky was entirely clear and full of stars of a brilliance that belongs only to the coldest nights, when the air has lost every molecule of moisture and there is nothing between you and the distance. I crossed the 40 steps to the barn. I stood outside the door and I listened before I opened it. From inside the barn, at 2 in the morning at 34 degrees below zero, with a wind that the following week's newspaper from Abilene would describe as the coldest recorded temperature in the history of Dickinson County. From inside the barn, I heard the slow, even rhythm of 11 animals breathing. I heard it before I opened the door. The sound was not distressed. It was the sound of large creatures in a state of ordinary rest. I stood in the most extreme cold I had ever experienced and listened to that sound for a moment, and I will not pretend I was unmoved by it. My grandmother in Vestlandet had told me a thing when I was 12 years old, and I had carried it across an ocean and 12 years of plains farming and one very difficult winter. And it was working. It was doing exactly what she had said it would do. I opened the door. The warmth that met me was not a dramatic warmth. It was not the warmth of a heated room. It was the warmth of a space that had been protected from the worst of what was outside, held, not heated, at a temperature that living things could manage. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. The cattle shifted at the lantern light and settled again. I found the water trough. I took off my glove and pressed my fingers into the water. It was cold. It had ice crystals forming at the edges, but the center was liquid. Outside, 34 degrees below zero. Inside, the water in the trough was liquid. I stood in the dark with my hand in the water, and I thought of my grandmother, and I thought of Agnes, and I thought of Eric, who would have believed in this from the first and would have been here to see it, and was not. And I put my glove back on and went back to the cabin. Whitmore came in the morning. I was outside when he arrived, cutting the ice from the cattle's water trough, and he pulled his horse to a stop at the fence line and sat there for a while without speaking. The temperature had risen to perhaps 5 below zero, which after the night felt almost tolerable. He looked at the barn. He looked at me. He looked at the cattle, which I had led into the small yard on the south side of the barn for their morning movement. "How many?" he said. 11, I said. He sat with that for a moment. "I lost 4, he said. "North corner of the big barn. Wind came through the chinking." He said it without apparent emotion, the way a man reports a fact he has finished arguing with. 4 animals. I told him I was sorry. I meant it. He nodded. He looked at the wall of the barn, at the clay surface, at the place where the sod roof met the top of the wall, at the angled stakes visible at the corner where the clay had developed a small crack and I had not yet patched it. He looked at all of it with the specific attention of a man who is no longer looking for what is wrong, but for what is there. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the road. He did not ask me anything that morning. He came back 4 days later, alone, and at an hour when no one else was on the road, and he asked me about the north wall, how thick the bundles were, how I had mixed the clay, what the angled stakes at the corners were for. He asked each question and listened to the answer and did not comment on what he heard. When he had asked what he came to ask, he thanked me and left. I do not know what he built the following autumn. I did not go to see. But the man who delivered the Hendricks store orders told me in October of 1874 that Whitmore had purchased a quantity of baling twine that had surprised him, considerably more than any cattle operation would require for normal purposes. I did not ask for elaboration. Collier had been writing for a long time when I finished. He looked up from the notebook and was quiet for a moment, in the way of a young man who has heard something he needs to let settle before he decides what he thinks about it. "Did you ever speak to Whitmore directly about it?" he asked. "About what you'd proven?" "No," I said. "Did you want to?" I considered this honestly. In the first days after, perhaps, there is a part of you that wants the acknowledgement. That is a human part, and I do not think less of it. I picked up my coffee cup. But Whitmore was a man who showed you what he thought by what he did. He came back and asked his questions. The following year, he changed what he built. That was the conversation. It did not need words added to it. Collier looked at what he had written. "Agnes Friesen," he said. "You mentioned she passed last year." "March," I said. "She was in her middle 70s. She had been in this valley for 42 years. Did she know what it had led to? The barn, the technique spreading?" I thought about Agnes, about the way she worked without announcement, about the pot of food she brought the morning after the corner fell, and the 4 decades of quiet mornings afterward, about the way she held her hand against a clay wall to understand what it knew. Agnes was not a woman who measured things by what they led to, I said. She measured them by whether they were done correctly. The barn was done correctly. I think that was sufficient for her. Collier wrote something. "Is there anything you would want people to know?" he asked. "About that winter, about what you built, anything you feel hasn't been said." I looked out at the pasture. The cattle moved in the April light, which was a different light altogether from October. Warmer, more forgiving, the kind of light that lets you see things as they are without requiring you to account for everything at once. "Write Agnes Friesen's name clearly," I said. "She came from Ukraine with knowledge that her grandmother gave her, the same as I came from Norway with knowledge that my grandmother gave me. Neither of us invented anything. We only remembered it in the same place at the same time, which was fortunate." I set the cup down. The barn worked because 2 women who could barely speak to each other understood the same thing about cold and straw and the patience of the ground. Write that clearly. The rest of the story can take care of itself. Collier wrote for another minute. The morning had gone long and warm, and the cattle in the pasture were moving toward the water and then away from it in the unhurried way of animals with no particular urgency, which is the best condition for any living thing. I watched them for a while. 41 years from that December night, and I could still feel the cold of the water in that trough against my bare fingers. Still hear the breathing of 11 animals in a structure that had no business keeping them alive and did it anyway. Still see, when I closed my eyes, the stars above the frozen ground at 2 in the morning, the indifferent, ancient, brilliant stars of a Kansas winter, which do not care in the least what you have built or why, but shine equally on everything that is still standing when the light comes back. Everything still standing. That was enough. That had always been enough.